The Nevada desert is a cruel place. The sun rises like a fiery overseer, baking the land until the earth cracks into jagged mosaics of dust. In the late 1800s, men willingly threw themselves into this wasteland, lured by a single dream: gold. For some, it was salvation. For most, it was ruin. In 1892, Nevada's gold rush towns were little more than mud-choked streets lined with false front saloons, gambling dens, and the occasional church that doubled as a courthouse. A stranger walking into one of these towns might see promise on the horizon, but if he stayed long enough, he would soon learn the promise was written in blood. Among the thousands of men who staked their lives in the desert were three unlikely partners. Their names would later be whispered in half-forgotten taverns and old letters, but their fates would vanish into silence. The first was Thomas "Iron Hand" McGraw, a Civil War veteran who had survived Shiloh with a musket ball still lodged in his shoulder. He walked with a limp, and his stiff right arm was nearly useless, but he had the grit of a man who refused to die. The war had left him with little patience for authority, and he never forgave sheriffs who wore their badges like crowns. The second was Elias Boone, the runaway son of a fiery preacher from Kentucky. Where Thomas was gruff, Elias was smooth-talking. He could charm a barmaid, talk his way out of a poker debt, and even convince a skeptical banker to extend credit. Yet his silver tongue was as much a curse as a gift. He often promised more than he could deliver. The last was Silas Kincaid, a man with a past as dark as a prospector's pan after a long day. Silas had once ridden with a gang of stagecoach robbers but claimed to have gone straight after barely escaping the hangman's noose in Texas. He was the most skilled with a rifle, the one who kept watch at night, and the one who never turned his back to the door of a saloon. Three men, unlikely allies, bound by desperation. Together they drifted into a forgotten mining town called Dry Creek, perched on the edge of Nevada's scorched wilderness. Dry Creek was a place that lived and died with the veins of ore hidden beneath its hills. When gold flowed, so did whiskey and blood. When the earth turned barren, the streets emptied overnight. It was in Dry Creek that Thomas, Elias, and Silas heard a rumor of an untouched claim, gold buried deep in a rocky ridge just a day's ride away. The locals dismissed it as another ghost tale told to keep drifters busy, but the three men smelled opportunity. With barely enough supplies for a week, they set out into the desert, swearing an oath that if fortune favored them, they would split it three ways. What they found was not just a trickle of gold, it was a vein so rich that even the most seasoned miners would have sworn it was a fable. Their pans glittered with dust, and their picks struck flakes large enough to make a man believe God himself had left a gift in the stone. By the third day, Elias scribbled their names on the official claim papers, his hands trembling with excitement. But in frontier towns, fortune was as dangerous as famine. News traveled faster than horse hooves, and by the time the men returned to Dry Creek, their discovery had already become the talk of every saloon. Men who once ignored them now watched with narrowed eyes. Drunks muttered that no Civil War cripple, no preacher's runaway, and no half-reformed outlaw deserved such luck. And looming above all was the town's sheriff, Harlan Crow. He was a broad man with a reputation darker than any outlaw he claimed to police. Crow had been elected by intimidation, not by votes, and was known to buy up claims from unlucky miners at the end of his revolver. Some whispered he took bribes from saloon owners, others swore he was in league with highway bandits. But one thing was certain, in Dry Creek, nothing happened without Sheriff Crow's shadow falling across it. When the three men swaggered into the local saloon that night, claim papers in Elias's coat pocket and gold dust still clinging to Silas's boots, Crow's cold eyes followed them. He raised his glass of whiskey, not in celebration, but in warning. The desert had given these men a fortune. But Dry Creek had a way of devouring its lucky sons. And by the time the sun rose again, their names would be etched into the long ledger of the forgotten frontier's most chilling crimes. The night the three men returned to Dry Creek with their discovery, the air inside the Silver Spur saloon felt charged, as if even the piano's tinny notes carried an edge of envy. Word of their gold had outrun them, carried by whispers and mule drivers who never missed a chance to exaggerate a story. By the time Elias Boone slammed a round of drinks onto their table and announced, "To our fortune, gentlemen," half the saloon was already listening. At first, the crowd cheered. In gold towns, every man's luck carried a sliver of hope for the rest. But as the whiskey flowed and the prospectors' laughter grew louder, the cheer gave way to something colder. Faces turned, eyes narrowed, and conversations hushed. No one had forgotten that fortunes in Dry Creek were rarely earned cleanly, or kept for long. The three partners tried to ignore the stares. Thomas McGraw sat back in his chair, his stiff arm resting on the table, his good hand never far from the revolver at his hip. Silas Kincaid leaned against the wall, chewing tobacco, his rifle propped at an angle no man dared question. Elias, ever the charmer, bought drinks for the house, laughing too loud, as though he believed generosity could shield them from jealousy. But in Dry Creek, gold was not just metal, it was motive. Sheriff Harlan Crow entered the saloon just past midnight, his boots thudding on the warped wooden planks. The room fell silent. Crow's very presence was a storm cloud. His badge, tarnished and dented, caught the lamplight as he pushed through the crowd with a grin that never reached his eyes. "Well now," he drawled, stopping at the Prospectors' table. "I hear congratulations are in order. A fine claim, they say. Rich enough to make 3 paupers into kings." Elias, ever eager to smooth waters, raised his glass. "Sheriff, we'd be honored if you joined us. There's enough fortune in that ridge for every man in this town." Crow smirked. "Generous words. But fortune's a fickle lady, Boone. She tends to favor men who know how to keep her safe. Tell me, are you 3 certain you can protect what's yours?" The question hung heavy. Crow's deputies, lurking near the door, exchanged knowing glances. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. Everyone in the saloon knew what happened to miners who refused to sell their claims to the sheriff. They vanished. Their gold vanished with them. And life in Dry Creek carried on as if they'd never existed. Silas spat into a brass spittoon, his jaw tightening. "We'll take our chances." Crow's eyes lingered on Silas, the ex-outlaw whose reputation was no secret. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping low enough that only the 3 men could hear. "Every rich strike draws wolves. Best you boys remember that. Wolves don't always howl before they bite." With that, Crow tipped his hat and left, the saloon exhaling in his absence like a man spared the gallows. The partners exchanged uneasy glances. Elias tried to laugh it off, but the tension was clear. Thomas muttered, "He means to take it. Mark my words." Silas's only reply was a curt nod. The following days turned the town into a cauldron of suspicion. Rival miners trailed the men to the general store. Strangers asked pointed questions about the ridge. Even the local blacksmith, usually indifferent to gossip, refused to shoe their mule, muttering that fools who strike it rich don't live long in Dry Creek. Still, the 3 pressed forward. They filed their claim with the territorial office, sealing their names to the deed. Elias tucked the papers into his coat, as though the thin sheets of parchment could shield them from bullets. They bought supplies, made plans for a proper dig, and dreamed of the lives they might build once the gold was theirs. But whispers grew louder. Some claimed the men had cheated in poker to fund their supplies. Others swore Silas had robbed a passing stagecoach to pay for dynamite. A few even spread the rumor that Thomas's discovery was nothing more than stolen or from another miner's shaft. None of it was proven, but in a town where envy fermented faster than whiskey, truth mattered little. The breaking point came one hot July evening. The partners, flush with confidence, returned to the Silver Spur for one last round before setting out to expand their dig. The saloon was packed, the piano hammering out a ragged tune, the air thick with cigar smoke. As they raised their glasses, a rival miner, big, bearded, and half-drunk, shouted across the room, "To hell with your claim. That ridge belongs to Dry Creek, not to a bunch of liars." The room erupted. Chairs scraped back, fists clenched, and the first punch flew. In seconds, the Silver Spur was a storm of shattered glass and flying bottles. Thomas swung his good arm like a hammer, Silas drew his rifle but held his fire, and Elias tried shouting over the chaos, his voice drowned in the roar. Shots rang out. One bullet struck the piano, silencing its jangling melody. Another splintered a whiskey bottle inches from Elias's head. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the fight broke apart, leaving the saloon wrecked, the floor slick with spilled liquor and blood. When the dust settled, the 3 men were still standing, but barely. They staggered into the street, their clothes torn, their faces bruised. In the shadows of the boardwalk, Sheriff Crow stood watching, arms folded, his grin cold and triumphant. That night would be the last time the town of Dry Creek saw Thomas McGraw, Elias Boone, and Silas Kincaid alive. July in Nevada is a cruel season. The desert holds its heat long after the sun sets, as though the earth itself refuses to release its anger. That night in 1892, the town of Dry Creek was restless. The Silver Spur Saloon still stank of sweat, liquor, and gunpowder from the brawl. A few broken chairs littered the street outside, reminders of the chaos. But for Thomas McGraw, Elias Boone, and Silas Kincaid, the night was not over. They had survived the fight, but survival was not victory. Their claim, tucked safely in Elias's coat, was worth more than all the lives in Dry Creek combined. And that made them targets. The three men staggered toward the livery stable to collect their mule. The animal's dark eyes reflected the lamplight, nervous, as if it too sensed danger. Silas whispered, "We leave now. Head for the ridge. We can camp out, keep the papers hidden until the office stamps M proper." Elias, ever the optimist, shook his head. "Crow won't dare touch us. We filed legal. Law's on our side." Thomas barked a laugh that sounded more like a growl. "Law? In this town? Crow is the law. And he just watched half the saloon try to kill us. Think he'll let us walk away rich?" Still, Elias insisted. He wanted one more drink, one more toast to fortune before they disappeared into the desert. Against his partner's better judgment, they followed him back inside. The Silver Spur was quieter now, its crowd thinned to diehards nursing wounds and whiskey. A piano string still dangled loose from where a bullet had struck. The air was tense, but Elias grinned, ordered a bottle, and began pouring. "To us," he declared. "The richest men this side of Carson City." The toast went unanswered. Thomas's eyes never left the doorway. Silas's hand stayed on his rifle. And when Sheriff Harlan Crow walked in a few minutes later, both men stiffened like cornered wolves. Crow strolled up to the bar, ordered nothing, and leaned against the counter. His deputies flanked him like shadows. His gaze fell on Elias, whose coat bulged with the folded claim papers. "Heard you boys caused quite a ruckus earlier," he said lightly, his smile sharp as glass. Thomas stood, bristling. "We didn't start it." "No," Crow agreed. "But it'll be you who finishes it." The words hung in the air, heavy as a gallows rope. And then, just as suddenly, Crow turned and walked out, his boots echoing on the planks. His deputies followed. The saloon exhaled again, as though spared another storm. Elias tried to laugh, but his voice faltered. "See? He's bluffing. He won't risk it." But Thomas and Silas knew better. Sometime past midnight, the three finally mounted their mule and rode out of Dry Creek. The desert air was still, the stars cold pinpricks against the black sky. They followed the wagon trail north, heading toward their ridge. Silence pressed on them, broken only by the mule's hooves and Elias humming nervously. They never arrived. By dawn, their camp was empty. The mule was found 2 miles from town, wandering with a slashed saddlebag and blood dried on its flank. Elias's coat, ripped and torn, was discovered snagged on a mesquite bush, the claim papers inside shredded as though someone had deliberately destroyed them. And the men themselves? Gone. Not a body. Not a boot print beyond the trail. As if the desert had swallowed them whole. Sheriff Crow wasted no time. That morning, he declared it a bandit ambush. He claimed a group of outlaws had attacked, stolen the gold, and carried the men off. No posse was formed. No search parties combed the desert. Crow signed the report with a flourish, and just like that, the richest claim in Dry Creek's history was erased. But not everyone believed him. A ranch hand swore he had seen wagon tracks leading away from the ridge, not toward the outlaw trails, but toward Crow's own ranch. A barmaid whispered that she had overheard one of Crow's deputies bragging about gold that spends itself. And late that night, the same barmaid vanished without a word, her room left empty save for a broken necklace on the floor. The town buzzed with rumors. Some claimed the Prospectors had faked their deaths to escape rivals. Others whispered that Crow had killed them himself, burying their bodies under his barn. A few even insisted the desert had taken them, swallowed by quicksand pits said to lurk in the arid flats. But the evidence, or what little there was, pointed to one chilling truth. 3 men had discovered wealth enough to change their lives forever, and within 24 hours, they had been erased. And the most damning evidence of all? The next week, Sheriff Crow filed a mining claim in his own name. On the exact ridge where Thomas McGraw, Elias Boone, and Silas Kincaid had struck gold. By the time the sun climbed high over Dry Creek, the official story was already set in stone. Sheriff Harlan Crow gathered the townsfolk outside the jailhouse and announced with solemn gravity that 3 unfortunate prospectors had been ambushed by bandits in the night. "God rest their souls," he said, hat pressed against his chest. "The desert is a cruel master. Their fortune was taken, their bodies likely left for coyotes. Let this be a warning to all who wander too far without the sheriff's protection." On the surface, it sounded convincing. But underneath, suspicion simmered. The people of Dry Creek weren't fools. They had lived too long under Crow's reign to miss the smell of rot when it wafted by. For one thing, no posse had been formed. In every other case of banditry, Crow had rounded up men to scour the desert, if only for show. But this time? Nothing. No search, no pursuit. It was as if he wanted the story to end before it even began. Then there was the mule. A miner named Jed Malone swore he had seen it tied up behind the sheriff's own barn the morning after the disappearance. When questioned, Crow laughed it off. "A mule's a mule," he said. "They all look alike." But Jed never forgot the distinctive scar above the animal's eye, the same scar he had seen countless times as the prospectors led it through town. And the claim papers? Elias Boone had been so proud, waving them about like a preacher with a Bible. Yet when the sheriff presented evidence of the attack, the papers were missing. Weeks later, a ranch boy claimed to have found scraps of parchment near Crow's ranch house, with smudged signatures still visible. But before anyone could confirm the story, the boy's father moved the family out of Dry Creek overnight, leaving behind their homestead and debts. The town buzzed with speculation, each rumor more damning than the last. A barmaid at the Silver Spur whispered that Crow had been seen late at night loading heavy sacks into a wagon. A stable boy claimed deputies carried tools, shovels, picks, even a saw, into the hills after dark. None of these stories reached the territorial authorities. Fear of Crow's wrath was stronger than any desire for justice. But then came the scandal that nearly cracked the town wide open. A prostitute named Mary Lou Crenshaw, sharp-tongued and fearless, claimed she overheard 2 of Crow's deputies boasting after the saloon brawl. They had laughed about free gold and how 3 fools wouldn't be needing it anymore. Mary Lou repeated the story to half the saloon the following night. Within hours, she was gone. Her room above the saloon stood empty, the sheets still warm, a single boot left behind. Crow declared she had run off with a cowboy. But no one believed it. Still, the sheriff's grip on Dry Creek was ironclad. Every potential witness suddenly grew quiet. Every loose tongue suddenly remembered debts owed or crimes forgiven by Crow's office. Fear strangled the town like barbed wire. Then came the most audacious twist. Crow himself filed a mining claim. 2 weeks after declaring the 3 prospectors dead, he marched into the territorial office and submitted papers for the very ridge Thomas, Elias, and Silas had discovered. The paperwork bore his name in bold script. When questioned, he claimed the ridge had always been unclaimed land and that he had merely protected it after the ambush. To the townsfolk, this was an outrage. To the outside world, it was legal. Crow celebrated openly, hosting a gathering at his ranch where he toasted to prosperity with whiskey stolen from the saloon. His deputies strutted through town in new boots. The general store clerk noticed Crow paying off long-standing debts with freshly minted coins. And yet, when a young reporter from Virginia City attempted to write a story about the vanished prospectors, he was run out of town within a day. The official record showed nothing suspicious: 3 prospectors killed by bandits, claim abandoned, sheriff rightfully staking land. End of story. But Dry Creek's back rooms and shadowed alleys told another version. Mothers warned their sons not to speak of the ridge. Old miners muttered that Crow had blood on his hands thicker than any outlaw. Even the preacher, Elias's own estranged father, who traveled west searching for his missing son, was threatened into silence when he demanded an investigation. And then, just when it seemed the scandal might die quietly, a shocking discovery threw the town back into chaos. Late one evening, a rancher named Caleb Foster, digging a new well on his property, unearthed a torn piece of cloth wedged deep in the soil. It was stiff with dried blood. The cloth bore the faded initials, TM, stitched into the corner, the mark Thomas McGraw had carried on every uniform and shirt since the war. Caleb hurried into town with the evidence, but by morning the cloth had disappeared from the sheriff's office, replaced with a note, mistaken identity. belonged to a drifter. The scandal burned hotter than ever, but Crow remained untouchable. His deputies enforced silence with fists and pistols. And in the end, the people of Dry Creek did what frontier towns often did when faced with corruption too great to fight: they shrugged, they swallowed, and they carried on. But the legend of the vanished prospectors, the bloody cloth, and the sheriff's stolen fortune would not fade. If anything, it was only just beginning. Dry Creek was never a quiet place, but after the disappearance of Thomas McGraw, Elias Boone, and Silas Kincaid, it seemed the very wind carried secrets. Whispers slipped through saloon doors and rattled down alleyways. They rode with cowboys across the plains, and they drifted into prayer at Sunday services. No one dared speak too loud, but the whispers were everywhere. The desert itself seemed to conspire in keeping the mystery alive. Travelers swore they saw strange wagon tracks in the sand, deep ruts that veered not toward the outlaw trails, as the sheriff's report had claimed, but directly toward Crow's ranch. A ranch hand who followed the tracks one evening returned pale and trembling. He refused to say what he had seen, only muttering, "The ground ain't clean out there." Within a week, he packed up and left town, abandoning his wages and livestock. More troubling still was the testimony of a woman known as Daisy Callahan, a prostitute who worked the upstairs rooms of the Silver Spur. Daisy had sharp ears and a sharper memory. She told friends she overheard Crow's deputies bragging in drunken laughter about gold that spends itself. She claimed they had joked about how the prospectors wouldn't be needing food, water, or air anymore. Daisy's words could have ignited the town. But one morning, her room was found empty. Her few belongings were neatly folded, her money still hidden beneath the floorboard, and her boots left by the door. It was as though she had stepped outside and dissolved into the desert wind. That was the second woman to vanish after speaking too much about the prospector's fate. The coincidence did not sit well with anyone. But still, no one confronted the sheriff. To accuse Crow openly was to sign your own death warrant. The rumors only deepened when prospectors passing through Dry Creek reported finding charred remains of a campfire near Crow's property. Among the ashes lay twisted bits of iron, the kind used for branding livestock. One piece still bore a faint K, and Silas Kincaid, the outlaw turned prospector, was known for marking his gear with a single letter. By now, the desert itself had become a stage for speculation. Some said the three men were buried under Crow's barn, their bodies weighted down with stolen ore. Others swore they were dumped in the abandoned shafts of a nearby mine, sealed off so no man would ever find them. A few of the more superstitious townsfolk insisted the desert had taken revenge itself, that greedy men who pulled too much gold from the earth were doomed to vanish, their souls swallowed into the sands. And then came the most chilling tale of all. One moonless night, a pair of Mexican herders camped by the ridge where the gold had first been found. They later claimed they were awakened by the sound of pickaxes striking stone, echoing faintly across the barren hills. When they crept closer, they swore they saw three shadowy figures digging feverishly in the moonlight. But as they approached, the figures simply faded into the darkness. The herders fled to Dry Creek, pale as ghosts themselves, and told their story. Some laughed it off as desert madness. Others nodded grimly, saying it was the restless spirits of McGraw, Boone, and Kincaid, still digging for a fortune they would never spend. Stories like these spread far beyond Dry Creek. Cowboys carried them east. Drifters repeated them in saloons from Carson City to Salt Lake. Soon, Dry Creek was no longer just another mining camp, it was a place of whispered curses and unspoken warnings. And the whispers weren't only about the dead men. They turned toward Sheriff Crow. His ranch, once a modest homestead, now bustled with suspicious activity. Wagons came and went at odd hours. His deputies, once poorly paid and ragged, suddenly strutted in fine boots and broad hats. At night, faint lights flickered from his barns as though work continued long after sundown. One particularly bold miner swore he saw Crow himself digging near the well on his property, long after midnight, by lantern light. When confronted, Crow sneered, "Man's got a right to dig on his own land." The miner disappeared from Dry Creek the very next week. What made the whispers scandalous wasn't just the suspicion of murder, it was the certainty of conspiracy. No one man could silence so many voices, erase so many lives, and still walk free. Crow's deputies had become more than enforcers, they were accomplices. The town had become his stage, and everyone else was forced to play along or vanish. And yet, despite all the whispers, no one dared act. Fear ruled Dry Creek as firmly as the sheriff's pistol. Families kept their heads low, miners avoided the ridge, and business limped along as though nothing had happened. Still, whispers have a way of festering. They do not disappear, they grow louder, more insistent, until one day, someone listens. For now, the desert kept its secrets. But decades later, long after Crow's death, the sands would shift, and the truth, or at least part of it, would claw its way back into the light. And that revelation would be more shocking than anyone could have imagined. By the time the 20th century arrived, Dry Creek was a shadow of itself. The gold veins had thinned, the saloons had emptied, and the dusty streets that once rang with gunfire and drunken songs grew eerily quiet. Sheriff Harlan Crow ruled until his death in 1909, never once challenged for his claim, never once charged with wrongdoing. To outsiders, he was remembered as a tough but fair lawman. To those who lived under his rule, he was a wolf wearing the skin of justice. The story of Thomas McGraw, Elias Boone, and Silas Kincaid slipped into legend, a cautionary tale told by old men in fading mining camps. The younger generation heard it with half a smile, assuming it was just another frontier ghost story, three foolish prospectors swallowed by the desert. But in 1921, 30 years after their disappearance, the desert finally spoke. It began innocently enough. Prohibition had turned Nevada into a land of bootleggers and hidden stills, and in Dry Creek, by then little more than a ghost town, rum runners used the abandoned buildings as way stations. One crew decided to draw water from an old, boarded-up well on what had once been Crow's ranch. They lowered a bucket, heard it strike something solid, and assumed it was rock. But when they hauled it up, what clattered against the rim wasn't stone. It was bone. Startled, they dropped lanterns down the shaft. In the flickering light, shapes emerged, skeletal remains tangled in rags of fabric, boots half-rotted but still recognizable. Among the bones was a tarnished brass button, the kind issued to Union soldiers during the Civil War. Stamped faintly into the metal were the letters U.S. The bootleggers fled in terror, but word spread quickly. Soon, curious townsfolk and opportunists gathered at the well. What they pulled from its depths chilled every man present. The skeleton wore a tattered coat sleeve stitched with the initials, TM, the mark Thomas McGraw had carried on every garment since the war. For the first time in 3 decades, the mystery had tangible evidence. Thomas McGraw hadn't vanished into desert sands. He had been dumped in a well, hidden like trash on the sheriff's property. The discovery sent ripples across Nevada. Newspapers in Reno and Virginia City seized the story, branding it the Dry Creek Well murder. Journalists dug into old records, interviewing anyone still alive who remembered the night of the disappearance. Former ranch hands admitted, off the record, that Crow often forced them to work late digging trenches near his barns. One confessed he once saw deputies unloading heavy sacks from a wagon the night after the prospectors vanished. He had kept quiet, fearing for his life. As the investigation deepened, another piece of evidence surfaced, a revolver rusted beyond use, found buried near the ranch. Its wooden grip bore the faint carving of a cross, a mark Elias Boone had etched into all his weapons as a boy, a habit from his preacher father. 2 men. 2 personal artifacts. Both tied directly to the missing prospectors. Both hidden on the sheriff's land. And yet, the twist only deepened from there. When territorial authorities attempted to formally investigate, they ran into an obstacle, the Crow family. Harlan Crow's sons had inherited his land and wielded considerable influence in Nevada politics by the 1920s. They dismissed the evidence as coincidence, claiming the well had been used as a general dumping ground for years. Any old relic could end up there, they argued. The sheriff's grandsons even staged a respectable burial for the remains, conveniently removing them from public view. But rumors persisted. Some locals swore more than one skeleton had been pulled from that well before authorities arrived. Others claimed to have seen deputies carrying additional bones away in sacks, disposing of them under cover of darkness. To this day, no official record confirms whether the remains belonged solely to Thomas McGraw, or whether Elias Boone and Silas Kincaid had been down there with him. The scandal threatened to undo the Crow family's carefully polished legacy. For years, Dry Creek had been held up as a model of frontier grit and law and order. But if the sheriff himself had murdered 3 men for their gold, then everything, The town's prosperity, its pride, even its survival, had been built on blood and theft. And then came the most controversial revelation of all. A former deputy, dying of pneumonia in Carson City, allegedly confessed to a priest that Crow himself had shot the prospectors after inviting them to his ranch. The claim papers, the gold dust, the very boots on their feet, all taken and hidden. According to the deputy, the bodies were dealt with in different ways, one buried, one burned, one dropped into the well. If the confession was true, then the discovery in 1921 was just the beginning. There could still be 2 bodies somewhere under the Nevada desert, waiting to be found. The priest who recorded the deathbed confession tried to submit it to authorities, but the document mysteriously vanished from church archives years later. Some say it was stolen by the Crow family to preserve their name. Others insist it still exists, tucked away in a forgotten file, waiting to resurface. The twist left only questions. Had Crow killed all 3 men personally? Were his deputies complicit? And why, if the gold vein was so rich, did it never yield as much as expected under Crow's ownership? Did someone else take a share, perhaps men higher up the territorial ladder who had protected him all along? By 1921, Crow was long dead, buried in an ornate grave funded by the very fortune he likely stole. Justice could no longer touch him. But the discovery in that well cracked his legacy wide open. Dry Creek, once forgotten, was now infamous. A ghost town haunted not by spirits, but by the stench of scandal. And the people of Nevada were left with a chilling truth: sometimes the lawman is the most dangerous outlaw of them all. The desert does not forget. It buries, it conceals, but it does not forgive. And in Dry Creek, Nevada, the silence left behind by Thomas McGraw, Elias Boone, and Silas Kincaid still lingers like smoke from an old fire. After the 1921 discovery in Sheriff Crow's well, the story might have ignited a reckoning. But instead, it faded into something more insidious, a silence so heavy that it became part of the land itself. The Crow family worked tirelessly to polish the sheriff's legacy, branding him as a stern protector of the frontier, not a murderer. They funded church repairs, sponsored political campaigns, and even published pamphlets praising the noble service of Sheriff Harlan Crow. For every whisper of truth, there was an official word of denial. The skeleton in the well? A drifter. The revolver with Elias Boone's cross carved into its grip? Coincidence. The torn coat sleeve with Thomas's initials? Belonged to another soldier. Even the deathbed confession of Crow's deputy was dismissed as the fevered ramblings of a dying man. But denial cannot erase memory. Old-timers continued to mutter in back rooms that Crow had built his fortune on stolen blood. Mothers still told their children not to wander near the ridge. Some even claimed that on moonless nights, you could still hear the faint clink of pickaxes in the distance, as though McGraw, Boone, and Kincaid were still working their gold vein in death, forever denied the chance to spend it. And so the legend grew, half fact, half myth, until it became one of the most enduring ghost stories of Nevada's mining frontier. Yet beneath the superstition lay a darker, more human truth. Dry Creek was not unique. Across the frontier, countless similar stories were buried beneath official records and polished obituaries. Lawmen who doubled as outlaws. Prospectors who vanished without trace. Claims that mysteriously changed hands after bandit attacks. The frontier was not built solely by grit and determination, it was built by greed, corruption, and the silence of those too afraid to speak. In many ways, that silence was its own crime. Witnesses who looked away. Townsfolk who swallowed their suspicions. Territorial officials who accepted Crow's paperwork without question. Every person who chose silence became an accomplice, ensuring that justice for McGraw, Boone, and Kincaid would never come. And what of the gold? That, too, remains a mystery. Though Crow claimed the ridge as his own, the yield never matched the promise of the prospector's first strike. Some believe he never found the main vein because the 3 men had already hidden part of it before their deaths. Others whisper that Crow did find it, but quietly smuggled the fortune east, laundering it through allies in Carson City and San Francisco. If true, the blood-soaked gold of Dry Creek may still sit in old family vaults, its owners blissfully ignorant, or willfully silent, about its origins. The scandal remains unresolved, suspended between myth and truth. Were all 3 men murdered by Crow? Did his deputies act alone? Was the gold cursed, swallowing every man who touched it? Or did the desert itself play executioner, with Crow merely seizing opportunity in the aftermath? The answers died with the sheriff, his deputies, and most of the town that enabled him. But the questions remain. Today, Dry Creek is little more than a scattering of ruins on the Nevada desert floor. Weather-beaten timbers, a crumbling stone chimney, the faint outlines of what was once the Silver Spur Saloon. Tourists who wander there sometimes report an uneasy stillness, as though the land itself resents their presence. A few claim to have seen shapes moving in the distance, 3 men trudging against the horizon, forever searching for the claim that cost them their lives. The truth may never be known. What is certain is this: America's frontier was not just a land of opportunity. It was a land where lawmen could be killers, where fortunes were bought in blood, and where silence was often deadlier than a bullet. And so, the story of Thomas McGraw, Elias Boone, and Silas Kincaid is not just about 3 vanished men. It is about how history chooses what to remember, and what to forget. Because if the sheriff of Dry Creek was guilty, then Nevada's prosperity, its gold, and perhaps even its respectability were built on a foundation of murder and cover-up. And if he wasn't guilty, then the question remains, who, or what, wanted those 3 men gone? That is the legacy of forgotten frontier crimes. A legacy of silence, scandal, and shadows that still cling to the desert like dust.